This morning we're going to be reading from 1 Thessalonians 4. I'm glad Peg Fox taught me all the books of the Bible because 1 Thessalonians is a hard book to find. 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 18. Brothers, we do not want you to be ignorant about those who fall asleep, or to grieve like the rest of men who have no hope. We believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep with him. According to the Lord's own word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left till the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage each other with these words. Good grief was among Charlie Brown's best-known phrases. It's an oxymoron, which is a figure of speech that seems to contradict itself, such as boneless ribs, fresh frozen, freezer burn, jumbo shrimp, small fortune, same difference, healthy tan, and of course, good grief. But today we're going to talk about grief, good grief. And the question is, how can grief be something that's good that hurts so much? And so Paul answered it in our reading today. How grief can be a good thing. Webster's dictionary defines grief as deep sorrow that is caused by loss, affliction, and disappointment. The top 10 leading causes of grief, and it's not, and this is not chronological per se, because we all grieve different events differently, but here are 10 of them. The death of a loved one, the divorce or loss of a relationship, the loss of a job, the death of a pet, loss of a home due to a fire or natural disaster, a financial setback, a loss due to theft or crime, moving away from family and loved ones, growing older, and being a witness to a traumatic event, such as 9/11, are all causes of grief. Now, we all have our own definition of grief because we know it all too well. And life is full of loss and grief, and there's no way to avoid it. Everyone dies. Even at weddings we mention it when the preacher says, "You promise to love each other until death do you part." There's no way to go over grief, to go under grief, or to go around grief. In the end, we all go through it. We all deal with grief differently. Some of us don't want to get out of bed. We just want to stay in bed all day with the covers over our head. Others just want to outwork it, and I'm one of those. You just want to stay ahead of it by working and thinking of other things. The thing is, there is no right way or wrong way to grieve. In his book, A Grief Observed, and I have a copy of it back in the office, C.S. Lewis dealt realistically with grief. And he said, nobody ever told me that grief felt like fear and guilt. Now, it is not easy to lose a loved one. No matter if they had a prolonged illness of an elderly person or the sudden death of a young person. We all have grief. Peter Grzowski said, after we lose somebody, and so we return now to a real but diminished world. Now, grieving is like going down a road that twists and turns, climbs hills and goes down in the valley, crosses rivers and plains, and then we go into a dark tunnel. It is a complex mixture of many ingredients which include sadness, anguish, fear, doubt, loneliness, helplessness, and despair. And we're filled with so many questions. Why did God let this happen? What is God's purpose? What could I have done differently to prevent this? And it's just like a scene from the movie As Good as It Gets, when the man said, I'm drowning. And all you can do is describe the water. Now, the thing about grief is we finally think we're over it. And bam, it hits us harder than ever before. An anniversary comes along, a birthday or a holiday. And here it is, ever stronger. We look at an empty chair, an empty bed, or empty swing, and realize that our loved ones are never going to sit in that chair again, never going to sleep in that bed again, or never going to swing in that swing again. There is what's called the grief cycle. And there are 5 stages in this grief process. The first is shock. The reality of the loss hasn't even sunk in yet. We go to the funeral home and we say, so-and-so is doing so well. You know why they're doing well? They really haven't comprehended yet, even though that person is laying right in the casket. They haven't comprehended yet that they're gone. They just think when they get home, they'll be there. The second stage is denial. We just refuse to believe it. We're just not going to think about it. The third stage is anger. We're angry at the doctors for not curing the person we love. Or if it was an accident, we're angry at the person who caused the accident. We're angry at the circumstances. We are angry at the one who passed away. How could they leave me? And we're angry at God. And by the way, it's all right to be angry at God. We just can't lose faith. A couple really good movies I've seen that deal well with grief. One is Still Magnolias. You remember that scene where Sally Fields is standing at the graveside? You're all nodding your head. And she clenches her fist and she said, I just want to hit somebody. I just want to hit somebody so hard that they feel the same pain that I do. And then one of the ladies grabbed another lady and said, here, hit her. And then everyone started laughing and it kind of broke up the tension. Another movie was Karina. Tina Majorino and Whoopi Goldberg. And Whoopi Goldberg, Tina was a little girl at 8 or 9. She lost her mom, only child. And Whoopi Goldberg was their servant, was their maid. And one day the little girl was trying to explain how she felt. And she said, I'm just so. And Whoopi says, you're mad. Yeah, I'm so mad. So Whoopi went and bought her one of those inflatable clowns that you hit them and they bounce back. And just told the girl, take your anger out on this clown. And the little girl's just hitting that clown. And it really seemed to help her. She was getting rid of her anger. The fourth stage is depression. There are some days you don't even want to get out of bed. You don't think you'll ever smile again, and much less laugh or enjoy yourself. C.S. Lewis said after his wife died, he says, no one ever told me about the laziness of grief. Not only writing, but even reading the letters too much, even shaving. What does it matter whether my cheek is rough or smooth? Life just seems so empty. And then the fifth and last stage of grief is acceptance. And for some of us, acceptance comes in weeks. For some, it takes years. For some, it never comes. But one day you wake up and that intense pain is just a dull pang. As one person said, you don't get over it, but you learn to accept it. So as American Christians, we have been programmed that we always have to look strong and in control. And there are many misconceptions about grief. There's a right way to grieve and there's a wrong way to grieve. Everyone grieves the same, so you have to grieve like me. Christians aren't supposed to grieve because it's a lack of faith. We'll grieve for a little while, then it goes away. Give it a year or so. It'll go away. So we see someone at a funeral, and we comment that they're doing so well. Well, they don't have to do well. Little do we know that under that brave and courageous smile, they're just a mess. Like my niece said, I just want to bite someone. Now, my sister lost her daughter 16 years ago, and every Christmas, every Easter, and on her birthday, which is May 22nd, so just a week ago, Peggy puts gifts on Julie's grave 3 times a year at least. And a couple years ago, one of her friends said, Peggy, you don't have to do that anymore. And Peggy looked at the woman and said, can I ask you a question? Yes. How many children have you lost? She said, well, I haven't lost any children. Peggy says, please don't tell me how to grieve for my daughter. Now, many people, even good Christians, struggle for the right words and the wrong words to say. And we say things like, well, it was God's will. But Peggy, and I mention Peggy so much because I learned so much about grief through watching Peggy's grief. And I'm her grief counselor. A woman came up to her, and here's Julie's closed casket. And she said, honey, God just needed another flower in his flower garden. Peggy looked at her and she says, well, why didn't she take your flower instead of mine? And that kind of ended that conversation. I put this in your bulletin. I think it's so good. Dear Abby was asked the advice of how to deal with someone who's grieving. How one handles grief, dear Abby said, is a personal matter. Let the one who has suffered a loss take the lead. If they feel like talking, encourage them to talk. If they prefer to sit in silence, don't intrude on their silence. Friends should call, bring food, offer to run errands, and do what needs to be done. A hug, a squeeze of the hand, or a look that just says, I'm here if you need me, conveys more than 1,000 words. And Peggy told me that there's something even worse than people saying insensitive things. People would avoid her because they were afraid of saying something wrong. They just didn't want to confront Peggy because they didn't want to hear the story over again, or they didn't want to confront her sadness, so they just avoided her. They'd see her coming, then they'd duck into her room or hide or leave or something. And she said that was the worst thing at all, being avoided. So, a little girl who was going into the 1st grade was told that a neighbor lady had just lost her husband after 55 years of marriage. So she asked if she could go to the store and buy the neighbor lady some flowers, and she took the flowers over to the lady, was gone about 15 minutes. And when she got home, her parents said, "What did you say to her?" And the little girl said, "I didn't say anything to her. I just climbed up on her lap and cried along with her." Now, I took a grief counseling course about 25 years ago. I was a young pastor, and I had done a lot of funerals, and I had a lot of grief, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I lived right next door. The church was right next door to Mercy Hospital in Springfield. You know the hospital well. Reverend McDaniel was the chaplain. I don't know if he's still there, and he may have dealt with you. But he recognized, because I was a volunteer chaplain, he recognized my grief, and he asked me if I would like to attend a grief counseling course, because I didn't know what grief was. And so I walked in the room with all these strangers and told my story, and I began to learn about theirs, and it was so therapeutic for me to be able to tell my story to people who wanted to listen to it. Now, I have done a lot of grief counselor. Like I said, I'm Peggy's grief counselor. I'm not certified. But you know what 90% of grief counseling is? It's listening. Listen to them, let them talk. I just told somebody the other day who recently lost a child. I said, if you want to come and talk, I'll listen, and I won't tell you how you're supposed to feel. And there is one rule about grief, and that rule is there are no rules. It has no rhyme or reason. I've done funerals for both my parents and my niece. Some pastor friends said, "How could you stand to do that?" Or, "Why weren't you with your family so you could also be comforted?" And I said, I knew how I wanted the service done. And if it wasn't done exactly the way I wanted, I'd be too critical. So I had to do their funeral. And I got through it. I did the funeral for my best friend Mike Biddle, who died in 1999 of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease. That one hit me hard. And I've done funerals for people I hardly knew. And some of them I think about for a few days. Others stay with me for a long time. There's no rhyme or reason. But I've learned to cheat when it comes to grief. And one of the reasons that I like doing funerals for, like, my parents is I get so busy in the planning, in the writing of the funeral, of being in charge of the funeral, that I am too busy to grieve. And so I think, well, I cheated it. But you know what? I haven't. It just hits me later. And it just keeps hitting and hitting and hitting. And so my niece Julie died in 2005. I was the adult in charge. And it's a long, long story, but she was Greek Orthodox. And they believed that unless they had the service in their church with their priest, she would not go to heaven. My sister wanted me to do the service, but they would not allow me because I was not ordained Greek Orthodox. So we had to coordinate two services, and I had to do it. That was one of my responsibilities. And then everybody was coming to me with their grief. I was managing everyone's grief. After the funeral was over, I was pastoring in North Carolina, and I was just so sad all the time. I didn't have my excitement back, my happiness back. Well, there is a pastor's retreat in North Carolina on the Elder Banks at Kill Devil Hills and Kitty Hawk. I didn't want to go, but I decided to go. They said it'd be good for me. Well, one day, I stood in the middle of the ocean with all the sharks. And it was a wavy day. Big waves were coming. And I just stood out in that ocean and I told God off. I told God what I thought about losing my niece. I wasn't happy about it. And I just cried to God about how sad I was. And every time a wave hit me, knocked me down and went out, a little of the grief left with it. And then another wave would hit me. And as it went back out, a little bit more grieving went with it. I stayed in the ocean for about an hour. I must have been a sight, yelling, crying. But you know what? I was part of something much bigger than me. The ocean was bigger than me, and God much bigger than the ocean. And that day, I still had grief, but I was functional. God allowed that grief to go away from me. And so it was just acknowledging that God loved me. The Bible deals with grief. In the Old Testament, we're told about the grief of King David after he lost his first son to Bathsheba because of his sin. And after his son died, David, he fell to the ground and prayed. He rose from the ground, he washed and anointed himself, he changed his clothes. Then he went to the house of the Lord and worshiped. Then he went back to the palace and he asked his servants for a meal. They said, "How can you eat after the death of your son?" And David answered, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I said, 'Who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me, and the child may live. But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? Someday I will go and be with him.'" That is so beautiful. David dealing realistically with grief. Then in the New Testament, the entire chapter of John 11 tells us about the death of Lazarus, one of Jesus' best friends. We have the response of the disciples. We have the response of Mary and Martha. We have the response of Jesus. It is a clinic on grief counseling, the 11th chapter of John is. And the Bible is such a practical book. It answers our questions and our needs even here in the 21st century. Like I said, grieving is a part of life. Look at the shortest verse in the Bible, John 11:35. Jesus wept. Jesus wept because he was grieving the loss of his friend Lazarus. But I believe that Jesus was also grieving all the people who died in the past, present, and future because of sin. One of the punishments is death, and Jesus grieved every one of them. So as a Christian, it's all right to grieve. Not grieving is not an option. It is not contempt of Christianity or lack of faith for us to grieve. We don't always have to go around with the sappy smile on our face telling everybody, "I'm all right." The good news is that we don't have to grieve alone. When we grieve, we need our family and we need our church family. We need our friends and we need our loved ones because grieving is so hard when we carry it alone. And some people choose to grieve alone. It's so hard. So people who don't know Jesus grieve without hope because there just doesn't seem to be a purpose to their loss. And they grieve because they have no hope of ever seeing that loved one again. Dead is dead, and that's all there is. I could not do a funeral or a graveside service if I did not believe 100% absolutely that I was going to see that person again and that their loved ones were going to see that person again. I don't know how in the world people go through the death of a loved one without Jesus. So Paul wrote this passage in 1 Thessalonians to tell us Christians not to grieve like those who have no hope, because God transforms our hopeless grief into hope-filled grief. And he does it through all his promises. Good grief. I have learned that grief is a gift from God. We love much or we grieve much because we love much. Shakespeare said, grief is a marble-hearted friend. But grief is a friend and grief is a gift because God allows us to remember that person. Yes, that memory is painful, but He allows us to believe. So in Psalm 35, the psalmist wrote, weeping may endure for the night, but there is joy in the morning. I enjoy the comic strip Family Circus or Family Circle. And I found this one, and if you can't see it, the reading is, looking at these pictures of Granddad kind of makes me feel like he's right here with that stick. But there was another one, and it was split. On the left side was the grandmother, who you see there, and one of her friends saying, I'm sorry you lost your husband. And on the right side, she answered her friend and she said, oh, I didn't lose my husband. I know right where he is. I'm the one that's lost. That's what grief does to us. It just makes us feel like we're lost. Now, grief is something we all have to go through, but it's not something we have to hang on to. I want to repeat that. Grief is something we all have to go through, but it is not something we have to hang on to. In the book of Ecclesiastes, a poet wrote, there's a time to weep and a time to laugh. There's a time to mourn and a time to dance. Yes, there is a time to weep and to mourn and to cry, but there's also a time when we're ready to laugh and dance again. It is not contempt against a person who passed away to be happy again, to have joy again. Sometimes we feel guilty, but we shouldn't. We shouldn't. We can choose to suffer the rest of our lives with grief if we continue to hang on to it, or we can choose to let go of it when it's time and have joy in our life. The message of Paul is, do not grieve like those who have no hope, but to have a hope-filled grief. And the reality is that behind grief is a powerful reality. Behind death is a powerful reality. That someday through the promises of Jesus, we're going to see that person again. A place where there is no pain, suffering, darkness, pain, tears, sorrow, grief, or separation. In Revelation 21:4, we read, He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things have passed away. Jim mentioned a few minutes ago how wonderful heaven's going to be. And in heaven there will be no grief, because there'll be nothing to grieve about. Amen. We are going to have our benediction, and then we're going to have our closing hymn. We're going to have our benediction and then say goodbye to our online friends, and after the benediction, we will sing our last hymn, He Giveth More Grace. And our benediction is this: yes, Lord, we all have grief. And Lord, as painful as grief is, we recognize it as a gift to remember. But Lord, beyond that grief is a powerful promise. A promise that someday we're going to be with that person again in a place where there is no reason to grieve. And so on this Memorial Day, we remember, and yes, we grieve, but we grieve with a hope-filled grief. Amen. Let's turn to hymn 707.
Thank you for joining us today. We would love to extend the opportunity to come and join us in person at Paoli Friends Meeting, located at 301 North Gospel Street, Paoli, Indiana. Sunday worship starts at 10:40 a.m. We look forward to seeing you.